The abandoned corridors of Shard's Edge space station groaned with the weight of their emptiness. 7 years after the structural incident that had condemned it, the station hung like a forgotten ornament at the edge of regulated space, its auxiliary sections still maintaining minimal functionality despite the official decommissioning. Glenn Mallory moved through the dim passageways with practiced efficiency. His footsteps echoed against metal floors, worn smooth by years of use and subsequent neglect. As a systems engineer assigned to final data purge operations, he had spent the last 3 weeks methodically ensuring that all station records were either archived or erased according to protocol. It was thankless work, but Glenn was nothing if not thorough. The cold blue emergency lighting cast long shadows as he made his way toward the central database hub. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air of the auxiliary section, where environmental controls had been reduced to minimal life support settings. The company hadn't seen fit to waste resources on comfort for the cleanup crew. Systems check Alpha 903 complete. Glenn spoke into his wrist recorder. Proceeding with anomaly verification in sectors 12 through 17. The anomaly had appeared during his routine scanning, a ghost entry in the food allocation logs that shouldn't exist. According to all official records, this section of Shard's Edge had been evacuated and sealed 7 years ago during the cascading systems failure that had damaged the station beyond economical repair. Yet someone or something was still drawing rations. Glenn paused at an intersection, consulting his datapad. The station's layout was a confusing maze of additions and modifications made over its 60-year operational history. What had begun as a simple research outpost had evolved into a sprawling complex of laboratories, living quarters, and support systems before the incident had rendered it all obsolete. The anomaly was registering from a section that had once housed detention facilities, a polite term for the holding cells where the station security had kept troublemakers until they could be transported to proper judicial facilities. Glenn frowned. Those areas should have been among the first evacuated. As he approached the sealed doorway that led to the detention block, a sound reached him, so faint that at first he thought he had imagined it. He paused, holding his breath. There it was again, a trembling cry that cut through the ambient hum of the station's systems, high-pitched and unmistakably childlike. Glenn felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Children weren't allowed on Shard's Edge, even before the evacuation. The station had been a research and military outpost, not a family habitation zone. His fingers hesitated over the door's access panel. Procedure dictated that he should report the anomaly and wait for a security team to investigate. But security teams meant reports, and reports meant delays, possibly weeks while bureaucracy ground through its processes. Meanwhile, if someone was trapped here... The cry came again, weaker this time. Glenn entered his override code, and the door slid open with a reluctant hiss. The air that escaped was stale and carried an unpleasant organic smell, the unmistakable odor of a space that had been inhabited for too long without proper ventilation. The detention block was a long corridor, lined with cells designed for temporary holding. Most had transparent doors, made of reinforced polycarbon, though years of disuse had left them clouded and scratched. The emergency lighting here was even dimmer, casting everything in an eerie blue twilight. The sound led him to the farthest cell, tucked away in a corner where the corridor bent. Unlike the others, this cell had been modified. The transparent door had been replaced with a metal one, with only a small viewing window set at eye level. The window was so dirty that Glenn had to wipe it with his sleeve to see inside. What he saw made his breath catch. The cell was small, no more than 3 meters square. In one corner, huddled on a thin mattress, were 2 figures. The larger one was clearly female, though not human. Her skin had the faint, blue-green tinge characteristic of the Lyrians, a species known for their work as translators and cultural intermediaries. Her once lustrous hair hung in matted blue-black tangles around a face that had grown gaunt with deprivation. She was curled protectively around a smaller figure, a child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, with the same blue-green skin but paler, almost translucent. The child was the source of the crying, though the sound had weakened to a whimper by now. Neither of them had noticed Glenn's presence yet. He stepped back from the window, mind racing. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a catastrophe. Someone had left a Lyrian woman and her child locked in a cell after the evacuation order. For 7 years. The thought made his stomach turn. How had they survived? The ghost entry in the food logs provided a partial answer. Someone had been delivering minimal rations, enough to keep them alive, but little more. But who? And why keep them prisoner at all? Glenn checked his datapad, searching for any record of Lyrian detainees. There was nothing. According to the official logs, these cells had been emptied during the evacuation. These two people didn't exist. He looked back through the window. The woman had noticed him now, and was staring at the window with a gaze that contained neither hope nor fear. Just the empty resignation of someone who had long ago given up expecting anything good from the world. Glenn's training told him to report this immediately. His superiors would send a team. There would be an investigation, and eventually, these two would be processed according to whatever protocols governed abandoned aliens on decommissioned stations. But something in that empty gaze made him hesitate. There was a story here, one that someone had gone to great lengths to erase, and if they'd been willing to leave these two to die slowly in a forgotten cell, what would they do if Glenn brought them to official attention, making a decision that would forever alter the course of his life? Glenn stepped away from the cell and headed back toward the supply depot. He would need food, real food, not the minimal survival rations they'd been subsisting on, and medical supplies, and time to figure out what to do next. As he walked, he began methodically altering his duty logs, creating a digital trail that would account for his movements without revealing his discovery. For the first time in his career, Glenn Mallory was going off protocol. The next morning, Glenn returned to the detention block with a pack full of supplies. He had spent the night poring over station records, looking for any mention of the Lyrian prisoners, but found nothing. It was as if someone had meticulously excised all evidence of their existence from the official databases. He approached the cell with caution. This time, the woman was waiting, standing near the door with the child half hidden behind her. Her posture was protective, but not aggressive. She was too weak for that. Glenn held up a container of fresh food, making sure she could see it through the window. "I've brought supplies," he said, knowing she might not understand him. Lyrians were known for their linguistic abilities, but he had no way of knowing if this particular individual spoke standard. To his surprise, she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from disuse, but the words perfectly formed in standard. Glenn entered the code to unlock the cell door. It swung open with a protesting creak of neglected hinges. He didn't step inside, instead placing the container on the floor and sliding it toward them with his foot. The woman didn't move immediately. "Why now?" she asked. Glenn shook his head. "I just found you yesterday. I didn't know anyone was here." She studied his face, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading more than just his expression. "You're not one of them," she finally said. "One of who?" "The ones who put us here. The ones who bring the food sometimes." Glenn frowned. "I don't know who's been feeding you. According to all records, this section is abandoned. You don't exist in any of the logs." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Yes, that was the point." The child peeked out from behind her, eyes wide and curious, despite the obvious signs of malnourishment. The woman gently nudged the container of food toward the little one, who fell upon it with desperate hunger. "My name is Glenn," he offered. "I'm a systems engineer. I'm here to help with the final data purge before the station is fully decommissioned. She nodded slowly. I am Sira. This is my daughter, Leary. She spoke the names with a subtle inflection that Glenn's human ears could barely detect, a hint of the complex tonal language that was the Lyrian's native tongue. How long have you been here? Glenn asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Since before the evacuation, Sira confirmed. 7 cycles of your years. I believe. Glenn felt sick. Why? What could possibly justify keeping you imprisoned after everyone else was evacuated? Sira's gaze dropped to her daughter, who was now eating with single-minded focus. I was a voice keeper, she said quietly. Do you know what that means? Glenn shook his head. My people, we carry stories, histories, truths. Some of us are trained from childhood to hold the most important ones, the voice keepers. I was assigned to your military research division as a cultural liaison. But what I saw there? She trailed off, her expression darkening. When I refused to participate in the forced breeding program they had established for captured Meridian prisoners, they decided I was a security risk. Too much knowledge, too little cooperation. But to leave you here during an evacuation. It was no oversight, Sira said flatly. The commander in charge made the decision personally. I heard them discussing it outside this cell. They called it containment of a biological security threat. Easier than killing us outright and creating records of execution. Glenn tried to process this information. He had known that military research took place on Shard's Edge, but nothing about prisoners or breeding programs. It was the kind of black site operation that never made it into official documentation. And your daughter? He asked. Born here, Sira said, stroking the child's tangled hair. Her father was one of the guards, the only one who showed me any kindness. He died in the incident that damaged the station. I think he would have helped us if he had lived. Leary looked up at the mention of her father. Dark eyes, solemn in her small face. She hadn't spoken a word since Glenn's arrival, but he could feel her watching him, assessing whether he represented danger or salvation. I need to go soon, Glenn said, checking the time. My absence will be noticed if I stay too long, but I'll come back tonight with more supplies, and I'll figure out how to get you out of here. Why would you help us? Sira asked, and there was no hope in her voice, only weary curiosity. Glenn considered the question. Because it's wrong. What's been done to you? And because if I don't, no one will. He left them with the supplies and made his way back through the station, his mind churning with what he had learned. The ghost entry in the food logs now made sense. Someone had been maintaining minimal life support and occasional food deliveries to the detention block, just enough to keep the prisoners alive, but ensure they remained forgotten. The question was, who? And how many people knew about the aliens left to rot in a cage at the edge of space? Over the next 3 days, Glenn established a routine. By day, he performed his assigned duties, methodically working through the data purge while subtly altering records to hide his visits to the detention block. By night, he brought supplies to Sira and Leary, food, clothing, medicine for the chronic respiratory infection that plagued the child in the cold, stale air of their cell. Slowly, Sira began to tell him more of her story. She had been a respected voice keeper on her homeworld, chosen to serve as a cultural attaché to the human military because of her exceptional linguistic abilities and eidetic memory. For 2 years, she had faithfully translated and interpreted, building bridges between species, until she discovered the secret research being conducted in the lower levels of Shard's Edge. They were using genetic material from captured Meridians to create biological weapons, she explained on the 3rd night, her voice low as Leary slept fitfully on the thin mattress. The Meridians are distantly related to my people. We share certain genetic markers. When I realized what they were doing, I refused to continue acting as interpreter for their interrogations. And they imprisoned you for that? Glenn asked. Not immediately, Sira said. First, they tried to convince me of the necessity of their work. When that failed, they threatened. When threats didn't work, they decided I knew too much to be allowed to leave, but was too valuable to kill. So they put me here, in this forgotten corner, and fabricated records saying I had been transferred off station. But surely someone would have noticed you were missing. Your people. We're told I had died in a shuttle accident, she finished for him. I learned this from one of the guards who enjoyed tormenting me with information. My family held a memorial service. My name was added to the remembrance walls on my homeworld. As far as anyone who cared about me knows, I have been dead for nearly 8 years. Glenn looked around the small cell, trying to imagine spending 7 years in such a space, believing you had been forgotten by the universe. And Leary. She was born here? Sira's expression softened slightly. Yes. Her father was a security officer named Tarn. He was kind to me, when the others were not. We found comfort in each other. When they discovered I was pregnant, they considered terminating the pregnancy. But one of the researchers argued for allowing it to continue, for observational purposes. Her lip curled in disgust. They treated my daughter's birth as a scientific curiosity, not the miracle it was. Tarn didn't help you escape? He tried, once, Sira said. He was caught and disciplined severely. After that, he could only visit rarely, bringing extra food when possible. He died during the station incident, a structural collapse in Section 8. I only learned of it when his visit stopped and one of the others told me, taking pleasure in my grief. Glenn felt a surge of anger. And after the evacuation order, how did you survive? Someone has continued to bring basic rations, not regularly, but enough to keep us alive. I've never seen their face. They used the delivery slot. She nodded toward a small hatch in the lower part of the door. No words, no acknowledgement. Just enough food and water to prevent death, delivered at random intervals. But why keep you alive at all? Glenn wondered. If they wanted to silence you? Death creates questions, Sira said simply. Bodies need to be disposed of, records created. A prisoner who slowly fades away in a forgotten cell creates no paperwork. And perhaps, whoever has been feeding us has just enough conscience to avoid being directly responsible for murder, but not enough to actually help us. Glenn looked at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable. Leary had begun to trust him a little, accepting the sweets he brought, and even showing him a crude drawing she had made on the wall with the colored stylus he had given her. The thought that she had never known any home but this cell filled him with a cold fury. I'm going to get you out of here, he promised. Both of you. Sira's expression remained guarded. How? The station is monitored. There are security protocols, cameras, checkpoints. I'm in charge of the data purge, Glenn reminded her. I have access to security systems, logs, cameras, and I've been creating a plan. He explained his idea. In 3 days, the station would undergo a scheduled system reset as part of the decommissioning process. All non-essential systems, including most security cameras and sensors, would be offline for approximately 40 minutes. During that window, Glenn would bring Sira and Leary to the maintenance dock, where a supply shuttle was scheduled to make its weekly delivery. I've already altered the manifest to include 3 special cargo containers, he told her. We'll hide you in 2 of them. I'll be in the 3rd. The shuttle will take us to Transfer Station Gamma, where we can disappear into the civilian traffic. You would risk your career, your freedom, for us? Sira asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Glenn thought about his life before discovering the cell. The quiet, orderly existence of a systems engineer who followed protocols and never questioned orders. The comfortable apartment on Ganymede, where he spent his leaves alone. The promotions he had earned through diligence rather than passion. Yes, he said simply. I would. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Glenn reviewed his plan for any weaknesses. The system reset would provide their window of opportunity, but there were still risks. The maintenance dock was staffed by a skeleton crew, but someone might notice 3 unexpected passengers boarding in cargo containers. And if their mysterious food provider checked on the prisoners during the escape attempt? Glenn's thoughts were interrupted by a notification on his datapad. A new duty assignment had been uploaded to his queue, a complete audit of the biological research archives, with priority flagging of any materials related to interspecies genetic compatibility studies. His blood ran cold. Someone knew, or at least, someone suspected. The next morning, Glenn made his way to the research archives with a sense of dread. The biological research section was housed in a separate wing, one that had supposedly been sterilized and sealed after the evacuation. His authorization codes shouldn't have granted him access, yet the doors opened at his approach. Inside, the laboratories were dark and cold, their equipment draped with protective coverings. Glenn followed the map on his datapad to the central server room, where isolated data nodes contained information too sensitive to be integrated into the main station network. As he connected his datapad to the first node, a voice spoke from the doorway behind him. "Finding everything you need, Engineer Mallory?" Glenn turned slowly. A tall, thin man stood watching him, dressed in the gray uniform of station administration rather than the blue of the engineering corps. His badge identified him as Dr. Elias Verne, Special Oversight Division. "Yes, sir," Glenn replied, keeping his voice steady. "Just beginning the audit as assigned." Dr. Verne stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Curious timing for such an audit, wouldn't you say? The station is weeks away from final shutdown." "I just follow the work orders, sir." Verne moved closer, examining Glenn's datapad screen. "And have you found anything interesting during your time here, engineer?" Glenn maintained a neutral expression. "The data purge has been proceeding according to protocol. Most systems were properly archived during the evacuation." "Most systems," Verne repeated, "but not all." "There are always anomalies in a structure this size," Glenn said carefully. "Ghost readings, power fluctuations in unused sections. Nothing significant." Verne smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Ghost readings. An apt term." He leaned against a dusty console. "Did you know that I was part of the original research team here? Before the incident, of course." Glenn shook his head. "Fascinating work," Verne continued. "Pushing the boundaries of what was possible, or even permissible. We made discoveries that could have changed the course of interspecies relations forever." His expression hardened. "Until certain ethical concerns interfered." A chill ran down Glenn's spine. This man had been part of the program Syrah had described, the one that had imprisoned her when she refused to cooperate. "I'm not sure I understand, sir," Glenn said. "No, I don't suppose you would," Verne straightened. "Complete your audit, Engineer Mallory. But remember that some data is classified for good reason. Some secrets are better left undisturbed." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and I've noticed you've been working unusual hours. Dedication is commendable, but don't exhaust yourself. The auxiliary sections can be hazardous when one is overtired." After Verne left, Glenn stood motionless for several minutes, heart pounding. The message had been clear. He was being watched. The plan would need to be accelerated. That night, Glenn made his way to the detention block with new urgency. He explained the encounter with Dr. Verne to Syrah, whose expression grew more alarmed with each detail. "He was one of them," she confirmed. "Not the director, but high in the hierarchy. A man who believed the ends justified any means." She clutched Leary closer. "If he suspects you found us, We move tonight, Glenn decided. I can trigger a localized simulation of a radiation surge in this section. It will force a temporary shutdown of the monitoring systems, while the station computers run diagnostics. Is that enough time? It has to be. Glenn knelt before Leary, who was watching him with solemn eyes. We're going on an adventure, he told her gently. We need to be very quiet and do exactly as I say. Can you do that? The child nodded, her first direct response to him. Glenn felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Good girl, he said. I need to make some preparations. I'll be back in 3 hours. Be ready to move quickly. Glenn spent the next 2 hours meticulously creating the electronic trail that would cover their escape. He programmed the simulated radiation surge, ensuring it would affect only the systems necessary for their plan. He altered the cargo manifests and created a false maintenance record that would explain his presence at the dock during off hours. As he worked, he kept expecting to hear Dr. Vern's voice behind him again, but the only sounds were the ambient hums and clicks of the dying station. Finally, he gathered the supplies they would need: environment suits modified to fit Sierra and Leary, identification chips programmed with false credentials, and a small case containing emergency medical supplies and credits. He was making his final checks when his datapad chimed with an incoming message. His blood froze when he saw the sender, Dr. Elias Vern. The message was brief. Audit deadline accelerated. All biological research archives to be secured by 0600 tomorrow. Your presence required for final verification before purge. This is top priority. Glenn checked the time. 23:42. Just over 6 hours before he was expected to meet with Vern. The man was forcing his hand, either suspicious enough to want Glenn under direct observation or planning something worse. There was no more time for careful planning. They had to move now. Glenn hurried through the darkened corridors toward the detention block, mentally reviewing the station's patrol schedules. The night shift was minimal, with most security functions handled by automated systems. If his simulated radiation surge worked as planned, those systems would be temporarily blind in the sectors they needed to traverse. He reached the cell and found Sierra and Leary waiting. The few possessions they had gathered, mostly the items Glenn had brought them over the past days, bundled in a small pack. Change of plans, he told them tersely. We go now. Put these on. He handed them the environment suits. The helmets will hide your features if we encounter anyone. Sierra helped Leary into the child-sized suit, while Glenn checked the corridor. Once they were ready, he activated the radiation surge program on his datapad. Red warning lights began to flash in the corridor, and an automated voice announced, Warning! Radiation anomaly detected in sections 12 through 17. All personnel evacuate affected areas. Automated systems entering diagnostic mode. Now, Glenn said, leading them from the cell. Stay close. They moved through the corridors as quickly as Leary's small legs would allow. Glenn had chosen a route that avoided the main thoroughfares, sticking to maintenance passageways and emergency routes that were seldom used. The radiation alert would keep most personnel away, but there was always the risk of encountering a security team responding to the alarm. They were halfway to the maintenance dock when Glenn's datapad chimed with another alert. He checked it and swore under his breath. What is it? Sierra asked, her voice muffled by the helmet. Someone's overriding the radiation alert. They're sending a security team to investigate. He checked the station schematic. We need to change course. He led them down a narrow utility shaft, using his engineer's access to open doors that would normally be sealed. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the station's infrastructure, away from the habitable sections. Leary stumbled, and Sierra caught her before she could fall. The child had been brave, not making a sound since they left the cell, but Glenn could see her trembling with fear and exertion. Almost there, he encouraged her. You're doing great. They emerged into a vast chamber, filled with massive pipes and conduits. the primary cooling system for the station's reactors. The space was rarely visited, except for maintenance, and the catwalks that spanned it were narrow and utilitarian. "The maintenance dock is just beyond that doorway," Glenn pointed. "Once we're through, we'll be in the cargo loading area. The supply shuttle is already docked. I checked the schedule. We just need to get to the cargo containers I've prepared." They were halfway across the catwalk when a door on the far side opened. Glenn pulled Syrah and Leary into the shadows behind a large junction box as a figure stepped into the chamber. It was Dr. Vern, accompanied by 2 security officers in tactical gear. "Spread out," Vern ordered. "The tracking system shows Engineer Mallory's datapad signal in this vicinity. Find him." Glenn silently cursed. He should have known the datapad would be tracked. It was standard procedure for all station personnel, but in his haste, he had forgotten to disable the locator. He motioned for Syrah and Leary to stay hidden, then carefully removed his datapad and slid it across the floor in the opposite direction. The small clatter it made echoed in the cavernous space. "There!" one of the security officers called, pointing toward the sound. The 3 men moved away from the door, following the noise. "Now," Glenn whispered. "Go!" They darted from their hiding place, keeping low as they ran for the exit. They were almost there when Leary's foot caught on a raised section of the catwalk. She fell with a small cry of pain. The sound carried in the chamber. Vern spun around, his eyes widening as he spotted the 3 figures by the door. "Stop them!" he shouted. The security officers drew their weapons. Glenn scooped Leary into his arms and pushed Syrah through the doorway. A stun blast hit the wall beside them, sending sparks cascading around them. Glenn slammed his fist on the emergency lockdown button beside the door, sealing it behind them. "That won't hold them long," he gasped. "Run!" The cargo loading area was dimly lit and filled with containers of various sizes. Glenn led them to a far corner, where 3 containers stood slightly apart from the others, their access panels already keyed to his biometric signature. "In here," he said, opening the first container. "Syrah, you take this one. Leary, you'll be with me." "No," Syrah said firmly. "Leary stays with me." Glenn wanted to argue. The child would be safer with him if they were discovered, but there was no time. Already he could hear the sound of the emergency door being overridden. "Fine," he agreed. "Both of you in this one. I'll be in the next, if anything happens to me. The shuttle's automated systems will still deliver the cargo to Transfer Station Gamma. Once there, find a woman named Nin at the flower market in the civilian sector. Tell her Glenn sent you. She'll help." Syrah hesitated, then placed a cool hand against his cheek. "Thank you," she said simply. "Whatever happens, know that you have saved us." Glenn helped them into the container, making sure the environmental controls were functioning properly, then sealed it. He had just closed himself in the second container when he heard voices in the cargo bay. "Check every container," Verna's voice ordered. "They can't have gone far." Glenn held his breath as footsteps approached. The security scanner would show 2 life signs in the first container if they checked. His only hope was that they wouldn't have time to search thoroughly before the shuttle's departure sequence began. As if in answer to his thoughts, a loud klaxon sounded, and an automated voice announced, "Attention, cargo shuttle departure sequence initiating. All personnel clear the loading area. Bay decompression in 60 seconds. The footsteps receded hurriedly. Even Vern wouldn't risk being caught in a decompressing bay. Standard procedure would require them to secure the area and wait for the shuttle to complete its loading cycle before resuming their search. Glenn felt the vibration as the loading mechanisms engaged, lifting the cargo containers and moving them into position for transfer to the shuttle. His container swayed slightly as it was picked up, then settled onto the shuttle's cargo bed with a gentle thump. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, with a slight jolt, the shuttle disengaged from the station and began its journey to Transfer Station Gamma. Glenn waited until the shuttle's engines had reached cruising thrust before carefully opening his container. The cargo hold was dark, except for status lights on the various containers, but it was empty of personnel. He made his way to Sierra and Leary's container and unlocked it. They emerged cautiously, Leary clinging to her mother's hand. "Did we escape?" the child asked, speaking for the first time in Glenn's presence. Her voice was small and tremulous, but the sound of it filled him with unexpected joy. "Yes," he told her, smiling. "We escaped." The journey to Transfer Station Gamma took 6 hours. Glenn spent the time erasing all evidence of their presence on the shuttle systems and creating new identification credentials using the emergency kit he had prepared. By the time they docked, Sierra and Leary had been transformed, at least on paper, into refugees from the outer colonies, with Glenn listed as their sponsor. Transfer Station Gamma was a bustling hub of commercial and civilian traffic, large enough that 3 more passengers among thousands would hardly be noticed. Glenn led them through the crowded corridors, Leary now walking between them, her small hand held tightly in his. The flower market was located in the civilian sector, a surprisingly lush oasis of color and scent amid the sterile station environment. Stands and small shops lined a circular plaza, each displaying blooms from dozens of worlds. At the far end, a small woman with dark hair streaked with silver was arranging delicate blue flowers in a display case. "Nin," Glenn called softly as they approached. The woman looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the unusual trio. She beckoned them into her shop, closing the door behind them. "Glenn Mallory," she said, her voice carrying the lilting accent of the Centauri colonies. "I wondered if I would ever see you again." Her gaze moved to Sierra and Leary. "And who are your friends?" "People who need help," Glenn said. "The kind only you can provide." Nin studied the aliens carefully, noting their exhaustion and the wariness in Sierra's eyes. "Unofficial help, I assume." Glenn nodded. "They need to disappear. New identities. Transport to somewhere safe." "That kind of help doesn't come cheap," Nin observed. Without hesitation, Glenn removed his identification chip and placed it on the counter. "This gives access to my accounts. Take what you need." Nin raised an eyebrow. "You're giving up everything? Your career, your savings, your identity?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then it must be important." She turned to Sierra. "You and your child can stay in my back room for now. It's small but private. Rest, eat. We'll talk about next steps when you're stronger." As Nin led Sierra and Leary to the back of the shop, Glenn felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. They were safe. At least for the moment. Vern and his security team would be searching the station by now, but they would find no trace of the fugitives. Later, after Leary had fallen asleep on a pallet of soft blankets, Nin and Glenn sat with Sierra in the small living area behind the shop. Glenn explained everything, how he had found them, who had imprisoned them, and why they had fled. "Voice keepers," Nin said thoughtfully when he had finished. "I've heard of them. Living archives, with perfect recall and the ability to transmit memories with absolute fidelity. Rare and highly valued." Sierra nodded. "Among my people, it is considered a sacred trust. We hold the histories that must not be forgotten, the truths that must be preserved." Her gaze hardened. "Including the truths about what your military was doing with Meridian prisoners." "That knowledge makes you dangerous," Nin observed. "To certain people, at least." "Yes," Sierra agreed. "Which is why we need more than just temporary shelter. We need to go somewhere beyond their reach." Nin considered this. "I might know a place. A small agricultural moon called Sparrow, on the outer rim. Officially, it's a failed terraforming project. Too much silicate in the soil for large-scale farming. Unofficially, it's become a haven for those who need to disappear. No central government, no extradition treaties, and far enough from the main shipping lanes that visitors are rare." "Can you get us there?" Glenn asked. "I have contacts," Nin said with a smile. It will take time to arrange, perhaps a week. Until then, you'll stay here. The station security has no reason to search a flower shop. Over the next week, Leary began to emerge from her shell. The child who had spent her entire life in a cell was fascinated by the flowers in Nin's shop. She would spend hours studying their colors and shapes, sometimes reaching out a tentative finger to stroke a delicate petal. Nin taught her the names of each variety and showed her how to care for them. Sira, too, grew stronger with proper food and rest. The hollow look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. She and Glenn spent long hours talking, filling in the gaps of each other's stories. He learned more about her life before captivity, her training as a voice keeper, her family on the Lyrian homeworld, the dreams she had abandoned when she was declared dead. "Do you want to contact them?" Glenn asked one evening. "Your family? Let them know you're alive." Sira's expression grew distant. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it would put them in danger. And after so long—" She shook her head. "The person they knew is gone. I am someone else now." "Who?" Glenn asked softly. She considered the question. "A survivor," she finally said. "A mother. Someone who is learning to live again, rather than just exist." She met his gaze. "Someone who is no longer dead inside." On the 8th day, Nin entered the back room with an excited gleam in her eye. "It's arranged," she told them. "A cargo ship leaving for the Outer Rim tomorrow. The captain owes me a favor. He'll take you as far as Junction Point, and from there, another contact will transport you to Sparrow." Glenn felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you, Nin. I don't know how to repay you." "Your accounts have already done that," she said with a wry smile. "But perhaps someday you can send me some of those blue mountain lilies that grow on Sparrow. They're impossible to get through regular channels." That night, as Sira put Leary to bed, Glenn stood at the small window that overlooked the station's central atrium. Somewhere out there, Dr. Verne was still searching. The man had dedicated his life to the kind of research that treated beings like Sira and Leary as specimens rather than people. He wouldn't give up easily. "You're worried," Sira said, joining him at the window. "Yes," Glenn admitted. "Verne has resources, connections. He might track us to the station." "But not beyond," Sira said confidently. "On Sparrow, we will be just 3 more settlers trying to coax life from difficult soil. No one will look for us there." "3?" Glenn repeated, surprised. Sira tilted her head. "Unless you had other plans." He hadn't. Not really. In the chaos of the escape, he hadn't thought beyond getting Sira and Leary to safety. His career was over. Using his clearance to help prisoners escape would be considered treason against the military establishment. His identity was compromised. His accounts emptied to pay for their new lives. "No," he said slowly. "No other plans." "Good," Sira said simply. "Leary has grown attached to you. And she hesitated. "I find your presence comforting." It wasn't a declaration of love. They were both too damaged, too cautious for that. But it was an acknowledgement of connection, of possibility. Glenn found himself smiling, truly smiling, for what felt like the first time in years. "Sparrow it is, then," he said. The cargo ship left Transfer Station Gamma the next morning, its departure unremarkable among dozens of similar vessels coming and going. In a small cabin, deep in its hold, 3 fugitives began the journey to their new home. 2 weeks later, they stood on the surface of Sparrow, breathing air that smelled of mineral dust and wild herbs. The settlement was small, just a cluster of prefabricated buildings, surrounded by struggling gardens and small fields. The blue-gray mountains that gave the moon its name rose in the distance, their peaks wreathed in clouds. Their new home was a simple structure on the outskirts of the settlement, a main room with a small kitchen area, 2 sleeping chambers, and a covered porch that looked out over a patch of uncultivated land. It wasn't much, but to Sira and Leary, after 7 years in a cell, it was paradise. Life on Sparrow developed its own rhythm. Glenn found work maintaining the settlement's environmental systems, his engineering skills valuable even without formal credentials. Sira, with her perfect memory and linguistic abilities, became an informal teacher for the settlement's children, preserving knowledge in a place where data terminals were luxuries. And Leary bloomed like the flowers Nin had taught her to love. Free from the confines of the cell, she ran through the fields, explored the foothills, and made friends among the settlement's eclectic population. Her laughter, once so rare, became a common sound in their small home. One evening, a year after their arrival, Glenn returned home to find Sira standing in what had once been bare ground behind their house. Now, row upon row of flowers grew there, blues and purples and whites, some native to Sparrow, others carefully cultivated from seeds they had brought with them. "Nin would approve," he said, joining her. Sira smiled. "Leary designed the patterns. She has an eye for beauty." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the double sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, they could see Leary playing with other children, her blue-green skin now a common sight in the settlement. "I received a message today," Sira said after a while. "Through the settlement's communication relay. Dr. Vern died 3 months ago. A laboratory accident on one of the research stations in the outer colonies." Glenn absorbed this information. "Does that mean—" "That we're safe, perhaps." Sira shrugged. "He wasn't the only one who knew about us, but without his driving obsession, I doubt anyone else will continue the search. We're just not important enough anymore." The news should have brought relief, but Glenn found himself feeling strangely hollow. Vern had been the face of the system that had imprisoned Sira and Leary, the embodiment of the cold bureaucracy that valued research over lives. With him gone, it was as if a chapter had closed. "We should celebrate," he suggested. Sira considered this, then nodded. "Yes, not for his death, but for our freedom. It feels more real now, somehow." That night, they held a small feast on their porch. Neighbors joined them, bringing dishes and drinks, filling the small house with conversation and laughter. No one asked about their past. On Sparrow, such questions were considered impolite, but they celebrated the present with genuine warmth. As the gathering wound down and their guests departed, Leary approached with something clutched in her hand. "I made this for you," she said, giving the object to Glenn. It was a small carving of a flower, meticulously shaped from the soft blue stone that was common in the foothills. The craftsmanship was impressive for a child her age, each petal delicately rendered. "It's beautiful," Glenn said, genuinely moved. "Thank you." "It's a remembrance flower," Leary explained seriously. "Mom taught me about them. On her world, they carve them to remember important things." "And what does this one remember?" Glenn asked. Leary's solemn eyes met his. "The day you heard me crying." Glenn felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Sira, who was watching them with a gentle smile. "The day that changed everything," he agreed, his voice rough. Later that night, after Leary had gone to bed, Glenn and Sira sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in Sparrow's clear sky. The small blue flower carving sat between them on the table, catching the soft light from the house. "She remembers, you know," Sira said quietly. "The cell, the cold, the hunger. She'll always remember." "I'm sorry," Glenn said. "Don't be," Sira replied. "Memory is what makes us who we are, the good and the bad together. As a voice keeper, I was taught that no memory should be erased, no matter how painful. They all have something to teach us." She reached across the table and took his hand, her cool fingers intertwining with his warmer ones. "What matters is that those memories are now part of a larger story. one with light and hope, not just darkness. Glenn looked at their joined hands, different in color and texture, but fitting together comfortably. "And what does that story say?" Sierra smiled, the expression transforming her face. "That sometimes, in the most forgotten corners of the universe, someone hears a child crying, and everything changes." In the small bedroom, Leary had crawled from her bed to the window. She knelt there, looking out at the two figures on the porch, their silhouettes outlined against the starry sky. With a finger dipped in the luminous paint Nin had sent in her last package, the child carefully traced the shape of a flower on the window frame, adding it to the growing garden of glowing blooms that now decorated the walls of her room. In the soft blue light, her face reflected the same peaceful expression as the carved flower she had given Glenn, a remembrance of the day when one human had heard a child crying in a forgotten cell and decided that compassion mattered more than protocols. Outside, under the vast canopy of stars, two survivors from different worlds sat hand in hand, building a future neither had dared to imagine. And somewhere, in the endless dark between the stars, a decommissioned station continued its slow decay, its secrets fading into silence, all except for one, which had escaped to bloom under an alien sky.